I'm going to turn our attention to pastoral skill building and talk about some of the nuts and bolts of beginning jail and prison ministry. Again, I can't teach you in an hour how to do this, but at least we can touch on the things that you need to be aware of if you haven't done this before, or if you are looking to deepen your level of skills. But before we do that, I just want to take a moment for a commercial interruption and give a plug for the Catholic Prison Ministries Coalition. I'm one of the founding members of it, and we started about a year ago, and the idea was to create a go-to place for everybody in the U.S. who's doing prison ministry, because we know that there's a lot of really good stuff going on out there, but we're all sort of siloed in our own work, and we don't know what people in the next diocese are doing, for that matter. And it may be that somebody in somewhere else is doing exactly what you need or want to be doing, and so you don't have to reinvent the wheel. You can, adopt their program. So we've created a website which you can reach now at CatholicPrisonMinistries.org. Our official website will be up and running in September, but now you can go to that website. You can find our webinars on that, and you can also input, and where it says join our mission, what you're doing, because we're looking to collect from everybody what they're doing so we can have this sort of central database for people who are looking for information and connections to go to. So again, that's CatholicPrisonMinistries.org, and then you can find our webinars there, and also you can join our mission, click on that, and enter the information about your organization or your work that you're doing in jail or prisons. Just one more thing on that. The Catholic Prison Ministries Coalition mission statement is that we promote Catholic ministry to all those affected by incarceration. Our goal is to recruit, train, support, and empower those called to minister with the poor and marginalized. We hope to create a more just and merciful criminal justice system aligned with the ministry of the Church and the teachings and example of Pope Francis. We will create opportunities to share resources and best practices to strengthen the Church's mission to advance restorative justice that upholds the dignity of every human person. So we think this is an exciting opportunity in the life of the Church, and certainly in the Catholic prison ministry and jail ministry for the next 10 years. So please join us as we begin this venture. I'd like to begin with a prayer. Again, if you remember, the theme for this conference is Partners in Pastoral Care, continuing the healing ministry of Jesus in the name of the Church. So let us pray. Merciful God, bless all who care for your people, wounded in body or mind or spirit. Gift our minds with knowledge and wisdom, our hands with the touch of kindness, our spirits with a deep compassion. Open our hearts and deepen our capacity for wonder, that we may recognize your face in all those we serve. And I make this prayer in Jesus' name. Amen. So first I want to start with a description of understanding jail and prison culture. Then I want to turn and talk a little bit about correction officer culture in the prison environment, because that's something that I'm very interested in. That's what I wrote my dissertation on. But I think it's important for us to know about that. And finally, have a discussion about what works in terms of worship and sacrament, praying with prisoners, what I found, general things that I found have worked over the years. But first, jail and prison culture. There's a book by a friend. His name is Lenny Spitale, S-P-I-T-A-L-E. You can find this in the resources. It's called Prison Ministry, Understanding Prison Culture Inside and Out. And he is an evangelical pastor in New Hampshire. He also did time in prison in New England. So he writes from his experience, and he writes very well about what prison is like. And so I want to share some of the thoughts that I learned from him about prison culture. Now, prisons are not nice places to live. They're not designed to be nice. However, it's important to remember that people are not sent to prison for punishment. Rather, they're sent to prison as punishment. That's an important distinction. The punishment is the loss of freedom, not the loss of their human dignity. People don't go to prison so we can torture them and make them feel horrible. They lose their freedom, and that's considered the punishment. But unfortunately, our current American culture doesn't tend to look at it that way. If people think of prisoners at all, it's usually with fear and judgment. The models for prisoners in the media are either pure evil or clownish caricatures. I've really never seen a realistic television portrayal of prisons, even those so-called, MS, those lockdown shows. They're really kind of distorted because they pick out people who are just, it's more for entertainment. It's not, if anything, if you really want to watch a show about prison, it would be probably 59 minutes of pure boredom, maybe with 1 minute of fear and excitement. So it's, one day is pretty much like the next one when you're in jails or prisons. Prisons in the United States are places of deprivation. People are stripped of their freedom to choose even basic things. They're social outcasts. They're separated from family, friends, and their community. It's a lonely and dehumanizing experience. And as volunteers or chaplains, we're not there to take sides, although we do have a moral responsibility to ensure people in jail and prison are treated humanely. But we're not there to judge the prisons or the prisoners. If we just offer sympathy for the prisoners without challenging them to be accountable for their actions, we're enabling them, we're not helping them. We don't do them any favors by siding with them against the guards or against the institution. But we also can't allow ourselves to become jaded and cynical, because religion and spirituality are meant to be forces of liberation, not tools of state control. The most common negative feelings in prisons and jails are frustration, fear, guilt, shame, anger, depression, anxiety, and feelings of hopelessness. Now, even psychologically healthy people are going to experience at times overwhelming feelings. Depression is a natural response to depressing circumstances. Fear is a natural response to dangerous circumstances. And we have to realize that this is something going on in the prison all the time. That they're depressing, often dangerous places, or at least they can be. So we have to recognize when we enter into a jail or a prison, we're entering into a new and often alien culture. Unless we happen to be somebody like Father Dustin was describing, people who've grown up almost in an incarcerated lifestyle. So these are especially people who grow up in communities of poverty and inner city communities where there's not, so much is already taken away before they even end up in the criminal justice system. But for most of us, it's an alien system. We have to realize that. We have to learn the language, and we have to learn the customs and the rules of this new place. And that takes time. It's like going to another country. Entering into a prison is entering into a new world with its own social life. And if anger is the predominant emotion in prison, then anti-authoritarianism is the predominant attitude. Most of these men and women have not had good experiences with authority, whether it's from their father or father figures to the cops to the prison authorities. Then you take prison stuffs hundreds of individuals with authority issues into the most totalitarian, authoritarian structure you can imagine. So it's a guarantee a problem set up already. Because what happens is prison culture admires defiance. And of course, this defiance has been romanticized by the media and by both the left and the right wing for decades. I'd say if anger is the predominant emotion, or perhaps fear and loneliness are important ones, the major spiritual illness of most prisoners is shame. And there's a difference between shame and guilt. Shame means that at the deepest level of one's being, they believe that they're no good. It's this radical sense of being worthless, bad, a nothing. And this is what lies at the root, I think, of most antisocial behavior. So you don't want to contribute to the divisions in prisons. You don't want to side with the prisoners against the administration. You need to be consistent, firm, and fair. And in terms of guilt, if shame is feeling at the heart of one's being that they're no good, guilt is simply recognizing I did something wrong. Guilt is saying I did something wrong. Shame is saying I am something wrong. And that's a big distinction. So there's nothing wrong with people admitting that they're guilty if they are, and dealing with that and processing that. But shame is far more dangerous and toxic, and that's the thing we need to address with compassion. You want to avoid the trap of becoming overly either romanticized or always taking the side of what the prisoner says without any kind of judgment or critical thinking. But you also don't want to become a cop with a collar on. because that's not a good thing. We're not there to be cops. We're there to be ministers. But you are working in a prison system, so you have to obey the basic rules of security. You cannot defy them. They're there for a reason, which is why, for example, you don't start dating inmates, or you don't bring things in that you're not supposed to bring in. You need to obey the rules, but remember, you don't want to become so rule-bound that you then become a cop yourself in there. Never disrespect in any way a prisoner in front of other prisoners, or in private for that matter. Everything that you say in prison will be heard and will probably be repeated. There's no secrets in prisons, and so the prisoners are very good at spotting phonies, so that they're going to know if you're being authentic or not. So be real. And so never give the prisoners a reason to mistrust, fear, or dislike you, and never give the COs a reason to mistrust, fear, or dislike you. Do not rat on them, don't go over their heads or treat them disrespectfully. Because I'm talking about both sides, because they can make your life miserable and they can sabotage your ministry. Don't play favorites with some prisoners over others. And especially, I notice like on death row, we have some celebrity prisoners, and people are always asking about them. It's like, I don't know, they're just like the other guys. I don't give them special treatment just because they made it to the front of the tabloids when they did their crimes. Avoid crazy people who want to volunteer, who have agendas of their own. Often you hear things like, I just had this burden from God to come into the prison and preach the gospel. It's like, that's great, but you know what? The gospel's already being preached, thank you. We don't need you to, you're not like appointed by God for this. You can join, but you're not like on a special mission. Be very careful of people like that, because they're nuts. Prisoners are going to be very guarded about their inner lives for a reason. So be careful to respect that, and don't betray that. They're used to being betrayed by the people that they love. And many have betrayed people that they loved. Prison can be a very cruel place, and it's a very, very small world. Mountains are made out of molehills there, and life can be a big soap opera. I mean, my choir in the Catholic chapel at San Quentin, they're talented guys, but it's really true. When the devil got kicked out of heaven, he landed in the choir, because it is a locus of drama. Every day I go in there, there's some new drama going on, and it doesn't help that they're all divas, but this is typical of prisoners. I mean, it's a very small world. You could expect to be tested, especially when you're starting out. They're not going to trust you right away. Of course, why should they? They don't know who you are. You need to earn their trust over time, and that's both true of the prisoners, and it's 10 times as true of the COs. They're not going to trust you for a couple of years. Get over it. Just get used to the fact that they do not trust you. They're going to be watching you. So do not give them any reason to prove what they're already thinking. Once you win them over, once you convince them that you're trustworthy, they'll do anything for you. But until that point, you have to earn their trust. You're not going to be given it. You're not entitled to it. And those of us who wear collars, that goes double. Jesuits, quadruple. Okay, you need to be authentic. Like I said, prisoners can smell a fake a mile away. Prisoners like to share their stories. They'll show you photographs of their family. Don't show them photographs of your family. Use common sense. It's not because they're going to get out and murder your family, but just because it's a boundary thing. You're not there to be sharing your personal life in any way with them. And really, do you want to be telling convicted sex abuse, criminal about your children? I mean, I think that would be kind of stupid. So you want to make sure that you're not oversharing your own life. Don't be sharing any of it, really. You don't have to be so guarded that where are you from? Well, I can't tell you. It's like, you can say, well, I live in San Francisco, or I live in so-and-so, but you don't want to tell them your address or any details of your parish. Just professionally, keep it at a professional level. The important thing about sharing, though, and listening to their stories is that they're missing their loved ones. They're missing their children, their wives, their parents. And so it's good for them to talk about it because it makes them feel connected to them. And that's something we can facilitate. Now, physical relationships are complicated, and I think men in prison tend to approach it differently than women. I think women prisoners tend to be more demonstrative and tend to bond and have intimate relationships, not necessarily sexual, but sometimes, but more just a sense of needing among friendship and support. The men need that too. They're just more kind of schizophrenic about it. But the basic need for love to love and to be loved is human. And so prisoners want connections with people, but again, you're not there to be that person. And men and women prisoners express their needs and their feelings differently. You just have to be aware of that. I've worked with both men and women in prison, and it's very different. You have to be sensitive to sort of the learned gendered attitudes of expressing themselves. And another thing is we also have to be sensitive to our own sort of cultural, class, educational, and race privilege, if we have that, and the presuppositions that come with that. You've got to be aware and honest of your own biases, prejudices, and racist programming. We live in a culture, as Father Dustin said, especially in the criminal justice system, it is completely contaminated by racism, and so are we. So we need to realize that, and we can't walk into it and pretend that we don't have blinders that have been put up by the way we've been raised. So you need to be honest about yourself and just realize, this is how I've been trained, or I think, but I can learn other ways of relating to people. But that's something really important, that we can't whitewash racism in this country. Prisons have their own economy, and it's very complex. That's one of the reasons you can't bring anything in, because if you give somebody something, that immediately becomes part of the economy. And so you can be contributing to a lot of possible negative things by giving something to somebody that you think is an innocuous thing, but for them it can be a source of power, drugs, any number of things. Everything in prison is for sale. That's drugs, cell phones, cigarettes, pornography, canteens, stamps, sex, prostitution, gambling, protection, strong-arming, stolen property. I've given many homilies on chicken stolen from the kitchen and sold on the tiers at San Quentin. And it's just, the guys always laugh, but they know it's true. Supplies from the warehouse or from anywhere, the hospital. Diabetic syringes are really popular, as you might imagine. But even things like Christmas cards, rosaries, and Bibles. Oh, I need a Bible, I need a rosary. Well, maybe they have 10 in their cell, but they can also sell these things, don't forget. So a lot of times people think, I'm just going to go into prison and start handing stuff out. I personally would prefer not to ever give rosaries out in prisons, because if the person really wants to pray the rosary, they can use their fingers. And otherwise it gets kind of degraded into jail jewelry and superstition. So be very careful when you're thinking about prison ministry. It's not about giving out swag. Okay, and so anyway, like I said earlier, you're not a prisoner. Most likely none of you have done 20 or more years of prison. You're always going to be an outsider going into this culture. But we can still be loved and valued by the prisoners. And the way we do that is because we just go in as ourselves honestly and learn, let them teach us what we need to know. Now, there's also, Spitali talks a lot about forgiveness in his book. And I would say forgiveness and reconciliation, as Father Dustin mentioned, is really at the heart of what all this ministry is about. It's the thing that I find most prisoners yearn for. The guys on death row, almost all of them express remorse and a desire for forgiveness from the victims or from the families of their victims. And I think we have to honor that. It's also sort of a cliche, but true, that I think self-forgiveness is really hard for a lot of these men and women because of the things they've done or what they've been told about themselves, the shame that they've internalized. So that's one thing that is helpful to help them get into a place of self-forgiveness, which is why 12 Steps is so helpful. Forgiveness from their families and or victims is really important. And the third thing would be the ability to forgive those who have hurt them, because, hurt people. Almost all the people I know in prison who have done something violent had violence done to them, especially as children. A lot of them had horrific childhoods. And so how do you forgive a parent who did these things to you? I don't know. But it's something that they need to work at. And that's kind of the power of the cross. Jesus as sort of if he can forgive me, then perhaps I can move on in forgiveness in my life, because that's where I think a lot of freedom can come. But how are you going to talk to prisoners about forgiveness? It's important that you have in your own mind an understanding of what forgiveness means. Is reconciliation something that you actually practice in your life? It's one thing to say, oh, you should go to confession, but when was the last time you went? So be careful that you're walking the walk that you're talking. And you want to talk about forgiveness in a way that makes sense to prisoners, not some abstract theological jargon, but really, what's in it for me? Well, what's in it for you is freedom, and the experience of not having to carry around all this burden in your life. But you need to figure this out ahead of time and pray about it so you have a way of making an account to them. What's the reason for your hope? And what's the reason for your belief in forgiveness? Because like I said, the spiritual climate of the prison is a battleground. There's real good and there's real evil there, and you'd be foolish to ignore either reality. So you need to be able to talk about God's grace, love, and mercy and forgiveness in your own words in a coherent and a simple way. That's actually the power of a lot of evangelical Christians in prisons, is they have a very simple elevator speech in terms of what the gospel means. And they've memorized it, and they believe it, and they do it, and it's very effective. Catholics can do that too. In fact, we have a much richer tradition to draw from, but we need to be able to draw from it and articulate it in a way that makes sense to prisoners. Now, one other thing, by the way, it's sort of an aside. I strive to use the word prisoner because I hate the word inmate. I find an inmate is somebody I think has been institutionalized and dehumanized, and I think part of what we need to do in our language is to respect the humanity of the people that we're dealing with, and the system wants to make them into inmates. An inmate is a controllable, docile, institutionalized thing, whereas a prisoner, I think, doesn't sound great to be a prisoner, but that's what they are. They are men and women who are being held against their will. So I just think, be careful of the language that we use in describing these people. Now, the next part I want to talk about is, having talked a little bit about prison culture, some of the things you need to be aware of, maybe, and careful about. First of all, don't get conned. Common sense is your best defense. There's a man in Massachusetts I've known since he's a lifer, he's doing life without. I've known him since he was in jail 25 years ago. And he is a professional convict, but he says to me, even the best cons get conned. So I mean, he realizes that there's no shame in it. You're going to get fooled. People will try to manipulate you. I mean, if your 3-year-old child tries to manipulate you, why wouldn't an adult who needs something? So don't get mad when people do that. It's their way of getting what they want. It's kind of a normal thing in those situations of deprivation. The important thing is you just don't allow yourself to fall for it so easily. After you've learned, maybe after the 100th time, you realize, I can say no, But learning how to say no lovingly takes time. But expect some manipulation. It's not like these evil people are manipulating and they're trying constantly to get around you, but they don't have anything and you have something. So of course they're going to want to figure out a way to get it. Manipulation means to manage or influence skillfully, especially in an unfair manner, to manipulate people's feelings to suit one's purpose or advantage. It's a skill. It's something that's been learned, and often these men and women we deal with in prison have been raised in extremely dysfunctional families and extremely dysfunctional communities, and manipulation is the only way they've had to survive. So realizing that, you don't get mad, you just realize this is the reality of prison life. And it's a survival tactic. When you're completely disempowered and stripped of everything, it's the only way you can perhaps get your needs met for basic things. Because prison by its very nature disempowers people, and it breeds manipulative behavior. You're never going to, as long as we have prisons, you're going to have manipulation. A prison takes normal human needs and it can kind of twist them and make them pathological. So you need to understand where power comes from in the system for prisoners. And power comes from information, any kind of information. It comes from drugs, it comes from things like possessions, it comes from their status in gangs, it comes from their prison job, depending on where they are in the institution. It comes from strength and intelligence. But knowledge is a big one, and information. And anything, like I said, anything and everything in prison is for sale. Tobacco, drugs and alcohol, prostitution, information, arts and office skills, cell phones. Those are a big thing. And you know where most cell phones and drugs come from? They don't come from visitors, and they certainly don't come from chaplains. They come from staff who come in and sell them and deal with them. So, and the warden told me that, not my current warden, but He said 85% of the contraband comes in through staff. So that's a reality of sort of the corruption of our system. Now, not all manipulation, like I said, is malicious, although sometimes it is. And not all prisoners are sociopaths, but some are. And all sociopaths are manipulative. So you have to be, just realize you're dealing with complicated people. Don't judge them right away, but be wary, be careful, be sensible, use your common sense. And if you remember, I tell my students this all the time, if you remember nothing else from this day, remember this: nothing in, nothing out. And I usually make them chant it several times. Nothing in, nothing out. I mean, you are not allowed to bring anything in for a reason, and you're not allowed to bring anything out for a reason. And it's for your safety and security, and for the safety and security of the prisons and for the staff as well. Don't bend those rules. Don't cheat. Don't, oh, I can bring this in for this person, they asked for this. You don't know where that could lead. It's extremely important that you follow that rule. Now, prison life, like I said, has its own culture, and rule 1 is don't snitch. Be loyal to your own kind, and in prison, that means you don't go outside your own race. You have to stay within the boundaries that the prison culture has established. Be a stand-up convict. Don't be overly friendly with staff, or certainly don't be overly friendly with cops. This is the sort of the convict culture here. Don't trust anybody. You want to appear strong at all times. Kindness equals weakness for a lot of these guys and women. And weak or fair game. Do unto others before they do you. Like I said, nothing is free in prison. Don't smile and don't cry, but everybody cries in prison, even the toughest looking guys. Expect lying and deception. Now that sounds kind of harsh, but these are things that you need to be aware of. Don't be so overly suspicious that it paralyzes you. But at the initial stages of volunteering, use your common sense. Realize you don't know what's going on in there at all. And if you have any questions, talk to your supervisor. Because most of the prisoners really do appreciate your presence there. They're not out there to manipulate and exploit you, but some are. But 99% of them really appreciate you being there. But you have to carry your side and don't do anything stupid. Learning how to say no, like I said, with love is really difficult, but it's really important. And the prisoners will respect you more if you say no, especially in the testing phase where they're trying to figure out where you're coming from. And boundaries, remember your boundaries. You're going in there, whether you're a volunteer or whether you're a paid staff, you're going in there as a professional person in many ways. So you have to remember you have professional boundaries. That means there's a power differential. You've got power, they don't. Prisoners are not your friends. They're like clients in a therapeutic ministerial relationship. And you never want to give them power over you by telling them too much about your life. So you don't give anything to them that they're not supposed to have. And don't make promises to people especially promises that you can't keep, because they're used to being let down by people who made them promises. So don't say, yeah, you'll do it if you're not going to do it. Never carry anything in and out of prison for them, because even something that seems really innocuous to you could be deadly. Don't give them gifts. Don't give them special attention. Don't mail letters for them. And don't give them personal information about yourself, like your phone number, for example. Don't pass notes from cell to cell for them, because that's not your job. Don't flirt. Don't let them flirt with you. Remember your boundaries. No hugging. It seems cruel, but why would you don't need to hug. Handshake is appropriate. They know you care about them. Prisons aren't huggy places. Don't gossip with them. Don't get involved in their politics. Don't pit one group against another. Don't disparage the staff or the COs with them. And don't overly identify with them. Don't go get a matching tattoo, because that's really cool, or whatever. You're not a convict, and you're not a guard. You're a chaplain. You're a volunteer. Again, always, if you have any questions when you're starting, talk to the chaplain or the supervisor in charge. That takes the focus off of you, and also I'd rather be the bad guy and say no than have my volunteers not do that. And if you do something, if you make a mistake, don't try to lie or cover it up. Just tell the truth, because then you can save your butt. If you try to lie about it and you get caught, then you're kicked out. Now, the last thing I guess I want to talk to, or second to last thing, is sensitively working with the staff. You know, there's no question that jails and prisons are really stressful places to work, and we have to be sensitive to what it's like for the people who work there, namely the correction officers. Stress is an unavoidable occupational hazard for correction officers. There's a high degree of job turnover. Nearly 60% of COs are going to quit their jobs before they retire. Their work causes emotional and behavior problems often, including depression, anxiety, burnout, substance abuse, family violence. I mean, it's hard not to take this stuff home with you. In fact, recent studies show that nearly 2/3 of correction officers show signs of PTSD. And everybody witnesses violence at work of some sort. And if they don't physically witness it, which is hard to imagine, they certainly experience the threat of it all the time. There is such a thing as a correctional officer culture, which you're never going to be part of because you're not wearing a uniform. But that culture, like any kind of law enforcement, cop culture, defines and shapes how and why things are done the way they are in jails and prisons, and why and how the COs are going to act. The convicts have a code, the cops have a code, and they stick to that code, and they're not going to violate it, because if they do, they're going to get ostracized by their peers. But I think it's most important that we approach the correction officers and the staff out of a place of compassion for them. They're not the enemy, they're not the bad guys. They're there to protect you as well as inmates. Now, are there bad people who do bad things? Yes, but there's lots of people in lots of professions who do bad things. We have to approach these men and women with compassion. Ideally, we have to find some way for them to be ministered to, although we don't want to be doing that in front of the prisoners, because we are there usually for the inmates and the prisoners, but they definitely need their own kind of ministry, the correction officers. Like I said earlier, the life expectancy for a correction officer in this country is 59 years old. They have, I believe it's the highest suicide rate of any profession. Most of them own weapons of some sort, so often suicide by gun is a common way for them to die. They're exposed to extremely stressful work experiences, plus they tend to work really unhealthy hours, and they'll do double shifts because they get paid extra, and then they end up getting caught up in this kind of constant lifestyle of stress and work. Now, since COs have as their primary responsibility the maintenance of safety and security, they have to monitor and supervise the prisoners carefully. That's their job. And their work brings them constantly into contact with the prisoners. And these are people who not only don't want to be there and resent them for guarding them, but they're also prisoners who have been exposed in their own lives to trauma and suffering. And so for the cops encountering these people who are traumatized, it's traumatizing for them as well. There's a thing called vicarious traumatization, where if you hang around people who have been traumatized, you're going to start to take on some of their trauma yourself. So this is the sort of thing that in the environment of the prison that correction officers have to absorb. So that's what we have to be sensitive to that, and certainly work to our ability to help them. And finally, in the last say 15 minutes or so, I'd like to talk a little about what I found over the years, what works in prisons, what I found works in terms of various forms of ministry. Obviously, you know, when I worked in the jail in Boston, I was a brother for about 10 years, and over time, the men and women would say to me, "Well, Brother George, we want you to be our priest, because you bring these old guys and we don't know them, but we know you, and we'd like you to be our priest." And so after like the 1000th time, I thought, well, maybe that's God inviting me to serve them as a priest. So I did request ordination at that point. But I find that sacramental ministry as a priest only takes up about 5% of my time. So it's not, while it's really, really important, there's a lot of things we do and need to do that aren't dependent upon a priest most days, such as Bible studies, praying, cell visits, things like that. I recommend for faith study, if you're doing any kind of RCA program, Dismas Ministries in Milwaukee, Wisconsin has a 3-part series called A Reason for Our Hope. I think I mentioned that earlier. And these were written with detainees and jail detainees and prisoners in mind. They're simple, doctrinally sound, well-organized Catholic introduction to our faith. There are review tests in each short booklet. Each book is about 50 pages long, and the whole series can be taught over a course of 2 to 3 months. It's perfect for RCIA because you can't, in a jail especially, you can't do a year-long RCA program. They're not there long enough. But it's basic catechesis, and it's in Spanish and English, which is great. I mean, there's a Spanish version that you can use. Part 1 presents, what's that? The title is A Reason for Our Hope. And there's 3 booklets. Part 1 talks about the sacraments. Part 2 talks about the Catholic faith based on the Apostles' Creed. And what I like about it too is it's written at maybe a 5th or 6th grade reading level, so it's not too complicated, but it's also not talking down to people. It's at the reading level of most prisoners. And part 3 is about Christian morality and the basics of Catholic moral teaching without coming across as preachy or judgmental, because most of the men I know at San Quentin have not lived model lives of purity. So if you come at them with a bunch of this stuff, they might get a little defensive. But the Dismas Ministry material is really good at presenting this in a loving way. And it uses the 10 Commandments as an outline to show how God calls us to love, and that the reason is this love is what makes us happy in this life and the next. And it really emphasizes dignity, freedom, responsibility, and conscience. These are all very pro-social things that we want to share with the prisoners. It presents sin and grace in simple and accessible terms, and is very faithful to the teaching, the tradition and teachings of the Catholic Church. So again, I think it's the best text, I think, that's out there for RCIA, or even just a basic introduction to Catholic teaching. Education is extremely important, and one of the reasons why this sort of text is helpful is because there's a lot of misinformation out there. I believe Father Dustin mentioned that a little earlier. He started working in the Panhandle in the South. There's an extraordinary amount of ignorance out there about what Catholics actually believe. Like the idea that Catholics are Christians is a revelation for people, that we're not pagan worshiping idolaters, that we only pray to Mary, we worship Mary, we don't worship Jesus. It's like stuff out there, and a lot of times ministers will not correct people in that misinformation. And Dale Resinella talks about this kind of an amusing way in his book, but it's anti-Catholic bias. It really isn't funny, though, unfortunately. And you can't assume that prisoners know anything about Catholicism, even if they were culturally Catholic. So what you end up here is having to deal with a lot of the need for a loving apologetics, not some sort of strident thing, but something, it's defense of the faith. You're not attacking other people's beliefs, but you're defending the truths of what we believe. Because often I'll hear things like, well, yeah, I was raised Catholic, but now I'm a Christian. And for a lot of us, we just find that it's jaw-droppingly shocking, but for them it makes perfect sense because they went to a Protestant Christian church and they actually heard about the gospel in a way that made sense to them. So we need to do that more ourselves. Rather than complain about evangelicals, we need to step up and do our job. There are some very good scriptural references for Catholic apologetics. There's one on it, and this will be in the resources as well. It's written by a Ghanaian priest, and it's in www.staycatholic.com, Catholic Apologetics Guide. I find that really helpful. Now, it can get tricky with apologetics because we're not trying to proselytize or put down other faith groups. But we have a responsibility to intelligently explain and defend our beliefs and our church. And like I said, it's been my experience that a lot of other church groups will not, they can be very subtly anti-Catholic, or they will not try to disabuse their congregants of ignorance. They'll content to let them, hey, you think they worship Mary? Fine, yeah, keep thinking that. So anyway, but that's ultimately they're not our problem. Our problem is ignorance, and that's something that we actually have an ability to address by education within the jails and the prisons. Most prisoners and detainees are not particularly churched people. They may not know a thing about Catholicism or Christianity, for that matter. Many are surprised to learn that Catholics really are Christian, that we believe in the Bible, and that we don't worship statues. But once you explain that, it's like, oh, they get it. It's like, it's not a big thing, but it does take some explanation. We can't assume they know anything. Apologetics doesn't mean going around saying, I'm sorry, by the way. It comes from a Greek word which means to make a reasoned defense of something or a justification for something. And again, it goes back to what Peter wrote in his first letter. Always be prepared to make a defense to anyone who calls you to account for the hope that is in you. But do it with gentleness and reverence, he says. So be sure that when we approach the apologetics, we're doing this out of love, not out of anger or trying to put other people down. A lot of prisoners have read the Bible more times than any of us ever will read because they've got plenty of time. They might know it front to back. And they've been exposed to groups ranging from the Assemblies of God, who are Pentecostal and not very pro-Catholic, to Jehovah's Witnesses who think Catholics work directly for Satan. Now, actually, I'm in charge of the Jehovah's Witnesses at San Quentin, and I love the guys. They're great. Now, they think I work for the devil, but we get along fine. And the thing is, listen, I'm not there to try to convince them. I'm there to help them do their religious thing. But the trouble is that a lot of prisoners are exposed to these various theologies, and it's confusing. And there's just a lot of misinformation and ignorance to overcome. So my advice to you is, as you're beginning prison ministry, arm yourself with good apologetics material, not like, super like crazy stuff that says everybody's going to hell except Catholics, but something that, but know the basics of the faith in a way that you can explain it. Catholic Answers has good material. And you don't want to go in there and go on the attack, because actually prisoners find that very entertaining. It's like, pitting one group against another. We don't want to do that. Our proper approach is respect and reverence for the other person, but we still have a right to defend our faith. Now, an example would be something to look out for is something like Chick publications. They're these horrible little comic books that pop up every now and then in prisons. Most prisons ban them, but they get in, and they're strongly anti-Catholic and anti-Mormon and anti-everything except their very narrow fundamentalist view of the world, and they're poisonous. And they've been, actually, this group has been identified as a hate group by the Southern Poverty Law Center. So they're not, but that stuff's out there. And so you have to be aware of that. And it should not be in your prison. It should not be floating around, because anything that puts down other groups is dangerous there. Now, when I began working as a chaplain, I remember in the jail, I was kind of skeptical about holy water, rosaries, holy cards, blessings, the kind of things people say, oh, can I have your blessing? And it's like, why do you want my blessing? I think what I've learned over time, though, is that these things are really important to a lot of prisoners because they're tangible. They're something they can touch. And for men and women who have struggled with addiction in their lives, they kind of think in black and white categories. And so if a rosary or holy water or a holy card is going to help them, fine. I'm not going to. I mean, the rosary is great for anybody, but you kind of want to meet them where they are spiritually, and then help them grow in their faith and deepen it. But there's two sides of the coin. One is you don't run in there with a bunch of swag, like I said, with a bunch of throw rosaries and holy cards at them. But if people want that, give it to them. As long as it's done in the context of faith and not superstition. Again, these are men and women whose lives have often been chaotic and often violent, and they need the comfort of something solid they can touch. That's sort of the practical stuff I wanted to say. Are you equipped to look for the hidden hope already present among the prisoners? Again, you're not bringing God in there. God's already there. God's already in these men and women. You're helping them to see that. But God can do perfectly fine without us. Do you know what hope looks like? Can you describe it to them in your words? Remember, this is not a ministry of words and ideas. It's a ministry of presence. It's a ministry of being present in the raw human suffering, dirtiness, smells, and messiness of prison. So do you know how to stand before people who are suffering in these situations and listen to them and not try to fix them? I'll close with this story, a brief story about a man in solitary confinement about a year ago. I saw him there, and he was, this is at San Quentin. He'd been in the in the hole for quite a while. And his cell was barren except for a small image of the Sacred Heart of Jesus that someone had given along with the Bible when he was put in the hole, so it was on the wall. And while in solitary, he had nothing to do all day. The cells are 5 feet wide by 11 feet deep. And he only got out of the cell 4 times a week for a few hours to a recreation cell that looks like a big dog kennel. And so it's a really bleak existence. The food offered them is adequate, but it's not enough to prevent a grown man from feeling hunger. So he was feeling hungry most of the time. And he said to me, pointing at the card, he said, "I'm so hungry I could eat that apple Jesus is holding," because it's Jesus holding his Sacred Heart. And I thought to myself, on one level, I thought, how poignant that is. He doesn't understand that it's what it means, but there's something acknowledging his hunger spiritually and physically, and he realized that Jesus could offer him something. It's a place to start. Even if he misinterpreted the Catholic symbol, he knew that Jesus was the solution for what he was missing. So that's where I'll stop for now. Thank you.